Hello, everyone, and welcome to Videocast number 2 for spiritofcecilia.com. My name is Brad Berzer, and I'm very glad that you've joined me today. It's great, and I'm excited about this podcast. I've been giving a lot of thought, and in fact, my son and I had a very long talk this morning about the meaning of human nature as understood within the context of creation and subcreation, as discussed by C.S. Lewis and by J.R.R. Tolkien. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind about Lewis and Tolkien is that they had a very strong concept of modern man as doubly fallen man. That is, agrarian man worked with the earth, got up with the sun, went to bed with the sun, was subject to the extreme tyranny of the seasons and had to live with that. But mechanical man has become something different, where mechanical man seeks not to appease and live within nature, but actually dominate and control and manipulate nature in some way. And Tolkien and Lewis and others, Christopher Dawson, G.K. Chesterton, William Morris, they were very disturbed by this possibility that man in the modern world would essentially become doubly fallen. Not only fallen from the fall in Eden, but then fallen again by worshiping the works of his own hands. That is a worry that modern man in some way becomes his own god. And so Lewis and Tolkien and other Christian humanists not only worried about this, but we find that in much of their literature, both in their fiction and in their nonfiction, they deal with this question all the time, asking us, what does it mean to be fully human? And of course, being fully human in the humanist sense means that we are both good and bad at the same time, and that we have to wrestle with those tendencies. So no matter how much we pursue virtue, that virtue can easily become corrupted into a kind of desire to be the best in terms of dominating others, not in terms of leavening or making better, but in terms of making like, trying to take someone and make them in our image rather than allow them to flourish in the way that God chose them to be or wants them to be. And this is a deadly sin in the modern world. So C.S. Lewis gives a talk about this, not specifically about mechanical man, but about modern man as secular man, in 1954 when he moved to Cambridge University. And this is one of my favorite books of his, a compilation put together after his death by Walter Hooper called Selected Literary Essays, if I remember properly, and I would have to double check, but I think that it came out in 1969 from Cambridge University Press. And in it, the opening essay is about the description of time, which is from the inaugural lecture that Lewis gave. And he writes, "At the very least, I was ready to welcome any increased flexibility in our conception of history. All lines of demarcation between what we call periods should be subject to constant revision. Would that we could dispense with them altogether. As a great Cambridge historian has said, unlike dates, periods are not facts. They are retrospective conceptions that we form about past events, useful to focused discussion. Nowhere else has no divisions, except perhaps those blessed barriers between day and night are sleeps. Change is never complete, and change never ceases. Nothing is ever quite finished with. It may always begin over again, and nothing is quite new. It was always somehow anticipated or prepared for. A seamless, formless continuity, immutability is the mode of our life, right? Constant change. Now, Lewis isn't giving us a progressive vision of history or a revolutionary view of history. He's giving us an English common law, Hayecian, incremental history in which the species over time learns what is wise and discards what is not. But this is always tenuous. Right? Man learns and then forgets, and relearns and then forgets, and sometimes relearns only partially or relearns incorrectly. So there's this constant change. And Lewis says, this is what we have to understand. History is incremental, not revolutionary. When it is revolutionary, we have to be quite worried, because then ego becomes predominant in any age. But to get back to Lewis, still less can we arrange a term's work or draw upon a lecture or a list. Thus we are driven back upon periods. All divisions will falsify our material to some extent, and the best one can hope is to choose those which falsify it the least. But because we must divide, to reduce the emphasis on any one traditional division must in the long run mean an increase of emphasis on some other division. And that is the subject I want to discuss. If we do not want to put the Great Divide, capital G, capital D, Great Divide, between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, which has been a constant trope in history, ancient man, medieval man, and then modern man, if we do not want to do that, where should we put it? I ask this question with the full consciousness that, in the reality studied, there is no Great Divide. There is nothing in history that quite corresponds to a coastline or a watershed in geography. If in spite of this I still think my question worth asking, that is certainly not because I claim for my answer more than a methodological value, or even much of that. Least of all would I wish it to be any less subject than others to continual attack and speedy revision. But I believe that the discussion is as good a way as any other of explaining how I look at the work you have given me. When I have finished it, I shall at least have laid the cards on the table, and you will know the worst. So what is it? If there is no divide, what's changed? And part, of course, Lewis's title is the description of time. Where does time change? Is time one of those things that begins and then moves moment by moment by moment relentlessly to some point? But Lewis is not a progressive. So time can't just be one chronological moment after another, or as one wag said, one damn thing after another. It has to be more than that. And yet, is there a periodization? Lewis says, well, maybe. How would you ever distinguish the Renaissance from the medieval? There's so many similarities there. And certainly the Renaissance could not exist without the medieval. And the Renaissance was in many ways the fulfillment or the derailment of the medieval. But it still relied intensely, intimately upon the period before it. So where is that great change? Yet Lewis says there is a change. And when does that change come? The change, he says, comes not between agricultural man and modern man, though that distinction is there, and not between medieval and Renaissance, though that distinction may also be there. But the real division comes between man who worships and man who does not, between religious man, whether pagan or Judeo-Christian or secular. That's where the real divide comes for C.S. Lewis. So, again, in this same speech, if you'll indulge me. But roughly speaking, we may say that whereas all history was for our ancestors divided into two periods, the pre-Christian and the Christian, the two only for us it falls into three, the pre-Christian, the Christian, and what may reasonably be called the post-Christian. This surely must make a momentous difference. I am not here considering either the christening or the unchristening from a theological point of view. I am considering them simply as cultural changes. When I do that, it appears to me that the second change is even more radical than the first. Christians and pagans have much more in common with each other than either has with a post-Christian. So a pagan or a Judeo-Christian have so much in common because they worship something other than themselves. And even if the pagan worships something false, she or he still worships something besides themselves, something beyond humanity. So the difference, as Lewis says, the gap between those who worship different gods is not so wide as between those who worship and those who do not. Let me repeat that since I messed that up. The gap between those who worship different gods is not so wide as that between those who worship and those who do not. That's the real divide. So constantly on social media and in the news, I see my fellow Christians lamenting how much paganism has resurfaced into the world. Lewis says, I would give anything for paganism to resurface in the world, because then you can at least challenge a believer from the standpoint of belief. There is something upon which to argue. But when you challenge against someone who is secular and atheistic, there is no common ground at all, nothing upon which we can latch and find or form some kind of argument in which we can understand one another. So, that's my thought for today. Really thinking about what it means to be human, what it means to be Judeo-Christian, what it means to be a person of faith, but to live in an age of increasing secularism, or perhaps an age of neo-paganism. And that's what we have to wrestle with, and that's what we have to think about. How do we challenge secularism and neo-paganism? All right, so as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, my name is Brad Berzer. I'm recording this from Hillsdale, Michigan. It's a dark, gloomy day. We're supposed to have a lot of rain coming in. It is January 9th, 2020. I hope that you are all doing well. If you get a chance and you like what I'm doing here and you want to help me continue with this, please hit subscribe down below and hit the thumbs up, and certainly let everybody know that you like this podcast or not. If you can share it, I would really appreciate it. Sorry to be so self-promoting, but we're just trying to get going here, and it would be great if we could spread the word for those of you who are interested that this is going on. I would also encourage you, please, to go to spiritofcecilia.com and subscribe there as well at our website. I also write for another website that is now coming up on its 10th anniversary that I founded with my extremely close friend Winston Elliott III. And that is called theimaginative-conservative.org. I do twice weekly writing there, so 2 columns a week. And I've had such a great time writing for Winston and theimaginative-conservative.org. So give both of those sites a look. Again, God bless. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in Videocast number 3. I'm already looking forward to it.